Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question asks if I can analyze the mental health and personality characteristics that may be at work in the Hillside Strangler case. This case highlighted the concern over somebody faking multiple personality disorder, which is now referred to as dissociative identity disorder, or DID. There were two people responsible for the Hillside Strangler murders, Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono. In this video, I'm focusing on Bianchi. Just a reminder here that I'm not diagnosing anybody, only speculating based on what could be happening in a situation like this. So first I'll take a look at Bianchi's background, then take a look at the crimes and what the outcome was. I'll look at the mental health and personality factors, and I'll also answer the question, who was the ringleader? So between Bianchi and Buono, who was really in charge? So starting with the background. Kenneth Bianchi was born on May 22nd, 1951 in Rochester, New York. His mother was 17 at the time, she was addicted to alcohol, and she was a prostitute. In August 1951, he was adopted by the Bianchis. He was their only child. So just a side note here, as I study these various killers, and specifically serial killers, there are several that have been adopted. Just to name a few, Ted Bundy, Joel Rifkin, David Berkowitz, and Eileen Wuornos. There's an idea here that maybe adoption is connected to people becoming serial killers, like maybe it contributes to that behavior. I've checked into this a few times and read some different literature on this. I'm not convinced there is a causal connection. Millions of people who are adopted avoid crimes entirely. It is interesting that we see this many killers who were adopted. So moving along with Bianchi's story, at age 2, Bianchi's mother, Frances, described him as a compulsive liar. That's fairly young to be labeled a compulsive liar. I can't recall ever seeing something like that before as I researched these killers. In late November 1954, we see Frances takes Bianchi to a physician because he's not sleeping and he's frequently wetting the bed. This is a common symptom of psychopathy. In that same visit, the physician indicates that Frances needs help. So the physician was more worried about Bianchi's mother than Bianchi. 1956, Bianchi is often going into trance-like states, characterized by his eyes rolling back in his head and him not paying attention to his surroundings. He's also having frequent anger and temper tantrums. Frances takes him to a physician. She is told that Bianchi has seizures, but not to worry about it, he will grow out of it. January 1957, while playing on a jungle gym, Bianchi falls off and injures his face. Head injuries are common with serial killers, but it's not clear if this accident resulted in a concussion. Then we move to the end of summer in 1957. Bianchi, now age 6, is once again brought to a physician because he's having episodes where his eyes are rolling back in his head. In 1959, he is formally treated for mental health symptoms, and in 1960, he is treated for tics, unruly behavior, and involuntary urination. Not long after this, he's diagnosed with passive-aggressive personality disorder. Now, this is a diagnosis that's no longer available in the DSM. Another difference nowadays is that somebody who is 9 years old would usually not get a diagnosis of a personality disorder. We don't see that too often currently. In 1962, we see his IQ is assessed, and his score is reported as 116. So that's over a standard deviation above the mean. Even with this high level of intelligence, he continues to get in trouble in school. In 1964, when Bianchi was 13, his father died suddenly. We see here that Bianchi shows no emotions and does not cry. From 1969 to 1976, we see a number of key events. Bianchi gets married. He's not satisfied with his wife. He has several affairs. That marriage only lasts a few months. He works as a security guard. He frequently steals jewelry and other items. He enrolls in a community college with the intent of becoming a police officer. We see he would get married again. The second marriage ends after 8 months. Evidently, his wife just left one day. And we see he applies to be a police officer and is rejected. So looking at this phase of life for Bianchi, I find it interesting that he had several affairs. Often serial killers really struggle in relationships with women. So the relationships are more distant, right? So they have trouble talking to women or relating to women. If he's having affairs, then he seems comfortable having relationships with women. He's approaching them, he's talking to them, he's interacting at several different levels. So again, kind of unusual for someone who had become a serial killer. From 1971 to 1973, the Alphabet murders took place in Rochester, New York, claiming 3 young female victims. Some circumstantial evidence tied Bianchi to these crimes, but he was never charged. In 1976, when Bianchi was 24, he moves to Los Angeles. He spends a lot of time with his older cousin, Angelo Buono. Angelo has a lot of interest in violence and sex. Evidently, Bianchi and Buono talk about this frequently. This really reminds me of the Richard Ramirez case. Ramirez had a cousin that he looked up to that had these same interests. Over the next year, we see Bianchi tries several times to get a job as a police officer. He is unsuccessful. He begins a romantic relationship with a woman named Kelly Boyd. They would have a son together. It was 1977 when we see Bianchi buys fake degrees in psychology and actually rents space from a licensed psychologist. His mental health practice was not successful. He only treated one client. I hope that client got a refund. I was thinking this client would have a legitimate concern about trusting a therapist after this. Like they could go to their next therapist and say, my last therapist was awful. He was literally a serial killer. Not many people could say that. This really just provides more evidence to the importance of professional licensure. Usually being a serial killer is frowned upon by licensing boards. It's really one of the few things they agree on, mostly because of all the killing involved. It doesn't facilitate a good therapist-client relationship. Bianchi and Buono wanted to get into the prostitution business. They wanted to buy a list of men who would be potential customers. 2 women, Deborah Noble and Yolanda Washington, sold them a list like this, but it was a fake. I'm not sure what the long-term plan was here. I guess they were hoping that Bianchi and Buono would notice, like maybe they weren't serious and they really wouldn't try to contact people on that list. This brings us to October 17, 1977. Bianchi and Buono find Yolanda Washington. They strangle her after assaulting her sexually. This is the first of the Hillside Strangler murders, but it would not be the last. Between October 1977 and February 1978, they assaulted and murdered 9 more women, ranging in age from 12 to 28, often luring victims with fake police badges. Several bodies are found on hillsides, leading to the name Hillside Strangler. After this, Bianchi moves to Bellingham, Washington, to be with Kelly Boyd and their son. There are also reports that Buono ordered Bianchi to leave because he was worried that Bianchi was a suspect. While in Washington, Bianchi works as a security guard and is accepted into a training program to be a reserve police officer. So again, we see him really pushing with this mission to become a cop. January 1979, now in Washington, we see 2 women, 22 and 27 years old, are reported missing, and the police later find their bodies in an abandoned car. Bianchi becomes a suspect because he tried to hire them to house sit. He actually left quite a few clues. He was caught very quickly after the bodies were discovered. During a search of Bianchi's home, the police discovered jewelry that is connected to 2 of the Los Angeles victims. So here we see the connection back to the Hillside Strangler murders. Angelo Buono was arrested in October of 1979 after being implicated by Bianchi. Now looking at their convictions, we see eventually Bianchi would plead guilty to 5 murders and would testify, albeit poorly, against Buono. Bianchi tried to make it seem like he was psychotic so that Buono would not be convicted. Both would be convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Buono would die in 2002. With Bianchi's sentence, technically he was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. He was denied parole in 2017. He will have another chance in 2025, but I would be very surprised if he was ever released. Now moving to the mental health and personality characteristics that we may see in a case like this. It's hard to imagine a serial killer with a more controversial mental health profile. Bianchi was diagnosed with many different disorders from many different professionals. There were 7 mental health professionals involved in the case. They spent over 65 hours evaluating Bianchi. All of it was recorded either on audio only or on video. We see a number of different opinions came out of this. Before I go through what they reported, I want to define insanity as they use the term. It's not the same thing as psychosis, although there is a substantial overlap. Insanity essentially has two elements here. The defendant cannot appreciate the criminality of their actions, and the defendant does not have the ability to control their actions or conform their actions to the requirements of the law. Now looking at what the mental health professionals reported regarding Bianchi. Two professionals were hired by the prosecution. One said that Bianchi was a sociopath, and the other said that he had antisocial personality disorder. So essentially the same construct. Both determined that he was not insane. Three professionals worked for the defense. One thought that Bianchi had dissociative reaction bordering on psychosis. The second one thought that he had severe multiple personality and the possibility of a brain disorder. And then the last one, Dr. Watkins, said dissociative reaction, multiple personality. I mentioned his name specifically because he wrote an article in 1984 about Bianchi's diagnosis and about the opinions of the other professionals. I'll talk about that article in a moment. All three of the professionals working for the defense believed Bianchi was insane. Both mental health professionals hired by the court found Bianchi to be insane, and one said that he had multiple personality. So again, we see a lot of different opinions about what was going on with Bianchi. Now going back to that 1984 paper I mentioned before, written by Dr. Watkins. This article is really fascinating. It's 34 pages of Watkins explaining what was going on with Bianchi and defending his position that Bianchi was insane and suffered from multiple personalities. Watkins came into the situation understanding the risks of trying to assess somebody like Bianchi. He knew that somebody like this could fake multiple personalities. He knew that Bianchi had a strong incentive to do that because he was facing the death penalty. He was aware that Bianchi had studied psychology, and he knew that somebody with sociopathy would be effective at manipulation. Going into this interview, he actually thought that Bianchi was sociopathic. So that's what he was starting with in terms of a diagnostic profile. So let's take a look at some of the evidence and how it was interpreted by Watkins. Watkins felt that Bianchi was willing to admit weaknesses and that a sociopath would not do that. Watkins did not feel that Bianchi's history showed antisocial behavior before the age of 15. The evidence that there were behavioral problems was attributed to multiple personalities. So what we see here is with antisocial personality disorder, a person has to have conduct disorder symptoms before the age of 15. So if we don't see those, it's really difficult to justify that diagnosis. I think the problem here is with Watkins, there were some behaviors that Bianchi had that would have qualified, but he looked at multiple personality and thought, okay, that really explains that behavior. So in a sense, he did find behavioral problems. He just gave them another explanation. In the study, Watkins talks at length about multiple hypnosis sessions and how this personality, Steve Walker, emerged the second time Bianchi was hypnotized. Right? So we have Ken, Bianchi, and then Steve Walker. This ostensibly is this other personality. Watkins was amazed at how different Ken and Steve were from one another. He noted they had different scores on the Rorschach test. Their handwriting was different. Steve would rip the filter off of cigarettes before smoking them, and Ken would not. And of course, their general demeanor was different. Steve Walker seemed like a sociopathic serial killer, and Ken seemed like a nice guy. Watkins was able to explain away the fact that the police had discovered that on the fake diploma that Bianchi had bought, the one related to psychology, the name on there was Steve Walker. But Watkins believed this was only proof that Steve had exerted influence on Ken. Steve must have put his name on the diploma. With all this in mind, with all this disagreement about Bianchi's mental health, what happened in the end? Well, eventually, Bianchi admitted that he was lying about the multiple personalities, and he was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. He said that he watched the movie Sybil, read the book The Three Faces of Eve, and had access to some other materials on psychology. Armed only with this, he was able to trick multiple, well-trained, experienced mental health professionals who were considered experts in their field. If we look at Bianchi's history, antisocial personality disorder does seem to align with his behavior. We see repeated criminality, lying, impulsivity, aggressiveness, a disregard for safety, irresponsibility, and a lack of remorse. He also attempted to become a police officer many times, probably because of the excitement seeking, and that's tied to psychopathy. Another reason is that he probably thought that police officers could commit these crimes more easily because they knew the system. In a sense, this was a reasonable assumption. We know that Bianchi would ride along with Los Angeles police as they were looking for the Hillside Strangler. I think there is this sense when mental health professionals deal with multiple personality in these types of settings that the diagnostic category itself is on trial because it's so controversial. Like if they can't figure out whether this person is lying or not, they can't figure it out in any setting, right? It jeopardizes the whole category. So they believe that they have an empirically valid method for determining who has the disorder and who does not. Of course, in reality, they don't have that at all. All the psychometric tests, all the interviewing, all the theory, none of it brought clarity to this case. Of course, with the exception of the two professionals who came up with the right diagnosis. I think what was really discovered in this case is that sociopaths have incredible powers of manipulation, which cannot be underestimated. They're able to fool friends and family, as was the case with Bianchi. Some can trick law enforcement, and some can fool mental health professionals. They put a lot of energy and thought into deception and playing on people's feelings. It's incredibly discouraging that so many experts were fooled by Bianchi. It's one of the difficulties with having a diagnosis that is subjective. The reality is that a lot of people could fake this disorder. A number of people do, and there is no way to be sure when somebody is faking or not. Now, this could be said for a variety of mental disorders. All of them can be faked. But the consequences for somebody faking this disorder would potentially be freedom from the responsibility for criminal behavior. As I mentioned before, multiple personality is now referred to as DID. It's a controversial disorder that divides the mental health community. It's cases like this that fuel skepticism and concerns that diagnostic procedures are not reliable and valid. So now moving to the last question here on the Hillside Strangler case. Who was the ringleader? So between Bianchi and Buono, who was really in charge? There's really no way to know for sure. Both of them took an active role in the murders. Bianchi was the one with the superficial charm. He would try to fool the victims into believing he was a police officer or some other trusted individual. Buono was the career criminal with a violent past, but not a history of committing murder. I think he was also the one a little bit more worried about being caught. For instance, he was the one that stopped them from killing Peter Lorre's daughter. They had pulled her over, but when Buono saw her driver's license, he let her go. He was probably concerned that killing somebody like that would really draw a lot of attention from the police, even more than they already had. Now, when Bianchi went to Washington, he continued to kill, and Buono stopped committing murders. It seems as though Bianchi really brought the murder element, and Buono responded. He probably would not have killed without Bianchi, but it seems likely that Bianchi would have committed the murder without Buono. That doesn't make Bianchi the leader automatically, rather just illustrates how they brought something different to the pair. They each had a different role. Sometimes people say, what are the chances that two serial killers would know each other and then work together? I think that really wasn't what was going on here. I think that one was the killer and the other one followed. So they both had the potential to kill, but Bianchi was really the killer to start with. At the same time, I don't know if Buono was in charge, but he was controlling how much risk they took, as I mentioned, which may explain why Bianchi was arrested right away in Washington. Buono wasn't there to regulate his behavior. It would seem that Buono was excited by Bianchi's drive, his desire to kill. In a sense, this unlocked Buono's desire to kill. And perhaps Bianchi was excited by the structure that Buono brought to their relationship. I know whenever I analyze serial killer cases, there will be a variety of opinions. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be interesting. Thanks for watching.